you have a chance to speak with anyone about witness out of order?
We need to finish Dr. Quinn today. He's scheduled to get his second COVID vaccine tomorrow morning. And obviously the timing of that matters. So we'll do our best to try and figure out when our witnesses can take time off again.
You broke up there for a second. I didn't hear all of that.
I'm sorry, can you hear me, Your Honor?
I can now, yes.
Okay. I said, I'm sorry, Dr. Quinn needs to finish today because he has his second COVID shot scheduled tomorrow, and we'll work to try and figure out when our clients can take time again, but our schedule will have to be shifted significantly, it's likely.
Okay. Well,
Thank you, though.
You're very welcome. Mr. Patterson, is Professor Quinn in the courtroom?
I am, yes.
All right, Mr. Patterson, you may ask your next question.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to bring up LX 182, and this is an article entitled, "Can Voter ID Laws Be Administered in a Race-Neutral Manner?" And Dr. Quinn, this is an article that you co-authored, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, let's go to page 3 of this article. And midway through the last paragraph on page 3. And it's a sentence starting thus. It says, "Thus, our results raise the question of whether it is operationally feasible to administer voter ID laws in a race-neutral manner in the current United States, unless presumably such laws are amended to require ID from all voters, such as some states currently require, or an intrusive system of monitors is implemented." Now, SB 824 requires poll workers to request ID from all voters, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Now, if lack of qualifying ID by a registered North Carolina voter were a crime, in your understanding of the criminal law, presence on your no-match list would fall short of establishing the level of certainty that one would require for a criminal conviction, correct?
So the thought experiment is causing me difficulty. So what are we convicting someone of?
A hypothetical crime of not possessing qualifying voter ID. And let's make it one of the forms of qualifying voter ID that you evaluated.
And the assumed evidence is an individual's presence on my no match list.
Yes.
I'm honestly not sure how to respond to that in the sense that given the no match list that I've constructed in this particular litigation, SB 824, I'm reasonably certain that there are individuals on the no match list who have passports, for instance. That would suggest that we're not sort of in the 99.9% world, which is, I've never served on a criminal jury, but that's my understanding, is that you need to be very close to certainty for a criminal conviction. And given that there are a number of individuals on the no match list who very likely have passports, I would not want to convict them of this hypothetical crime.
Well, let's change the hypothesis. The crime is not possessing one of the forms of qualifying ID that you evaluated. If that were the case, would presence on your no match list be sufficient evidence in your understanding of the criminal law to convict such a person of that crime?
Of not possessing a DMV issued ID, state employer ID, et cetera, that I did evaluate. Again, I'm having a hard time with the hypothetical. It's hard for me to imagine how being on the match list would be by itself sufficient evidence of criminal liability for something that's not a crime, I guess. So I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to drag this out. Honestly, I'm not trying to make this longer. It's just very difficult for me to think through like what that exactly means.
Okay, I thought it was relatively straightforward question, but we can move on here. You do not know whether there exists some combination of photo IDs that could be incorporated into SB 824 that would eliminate any racial disparity between African Americans and whites, correct?
Some combination of existing, and we're talking about photo IDs as well, correct?
Yes.
I'm not aware of what that would look like.
And as far as you know, SB 824 and the list of qualifying ID in SB 824 may produce the narrowest possible racial disparity between African Americans and whites holding qualifying ID, correct?
As I just testified, I don't know of other combinations that would change the racial disparity because it's not something that I've analyzed. Is it conceivable that the numbers I've uncovered are I forget what your exact term was, but the lowest racial disparity, something along those lines? I don't have evidence one way or the other on that question. What I can say is that there appears to be a racial disparity. African Americans are 39% more likely to lack qualifying ID than white voters.
Okay, just so I have your testimony then. So as far as you know, SB 824 and the list of qualifying ID in SB 824 may produce the narrowest possible racial disparity between African Americans and whites holding qualifying ID.
Objection asked and just
Correct.
answered.
Thing. Asking you a different question.
Okay, well, that was actually my last question, Your Honor, so I will stand down for now.
All right, Mr. Cox, do you have cross-examination questions?
Just very briefly, as a matter of clarification, Dr. Quinn, early in your direct testimony, you testified that HB 589 was struck down by the Fourth Circuit. Is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
And to be clear and to be sure the record is clear, the Fourth Circuit struck down a portion of HB 589, correct?
I'm not a legal expert. I'm not able to answer that question about what exactly was struck and what was not struck.
Okay, no further questions. Thank you.
Mr. Brockman, do you have any redirect?
Thank you, Your Honors. I do very briefly. Professor Quinn, counsel for the legislative defendants asked you a series of questions about the dates on which the DMV file and voter file that you used in your analysis were pulled. Do you recall that colloquy?
Yes.
Okay. To be clear for the court, did you select those dates?
No. I asked for the date. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did you have any control over the state entities that produced those files?
No.
Okay. And the dates were September 20th for the DMV file and October 17th for the voter file of 2020. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct.
When was your expert report in this case due?
December 2020. The exact date, I forget, December 20th, perhaps.
And does it take some time once you receive these large data files to prepare and produce your matching analysis and report?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. With respect to public assistance IDs, do you recall that counsel for the legislative defendants asked you about certain allegations in plaintiff's complaint about county public housing authorities?
Yes, I do.
Could you please turn to paragraph 26 of your December report, JX5?
Paragraph 26?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And the language there states that under House Bill 1169, voting would be allowed using, quote, an identification card issued by a department, agency, or entity of the United States government or this state for a government program of public assistance. Do you see that?
I do. Yes, that's what it states.
Doesn't state that a identification card issued by a county would be permitted for voting, does it?
Objection, Your Honor, both leading and he just testified that he is not expert in legal interpretation.
Your
Oh,
Honors, thank you. Professor Quinn, it doesn't say that a county ID card would be acceptable there in that text that's highlighted?
It does not. It specifies United States government or this state, which I assume means North Carolina.
Thank you. We can put that down. The Legislative Defendants Council also asked you a series of questions about different match strings that you could have used, including match strings based on first initial. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
Okay. Could you please turn to PDF page 29 of JX5, your December report, should be table 2. Now, composite match string number 3 uses first name, last name, and date of birth. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
If you had substituted first initial for first name in match string 3 and held everything else constant, would a voter named John Smith and a voter named Joseph Smith with the same birth date have matched?
Using first initial?
Yes,
Yes.
even though they're presumably not the same person.
Yes, presumably.
And looking at match string 4, if you substituted first initial for first name in this match string, would 2 siblings living in the same household with first names starting with the first initial be matches,
They would.
even though presumably they are also not the same person?
Yes, that's correct.
Are those examples of why you did not use first initial in your match strings?
Those would be 2 sorts of problems that would be generated by using just first initial. Yes, that's correct.
And we can take that down, please. Now, do you recall that counsel for the legislative defendants asked you some questions about your critiques of Professor Callinan's analysis in this case and how that compared to your evaluation of ANES data in your sensitivity analysis?
Yes.
And you wanted to explain to the court how your analysis differed from Professor Callinan's. Do you recall that?
I believe so, yes.
Would you still like to explain to the court the distinction you wanted to make then between your work and Professor Callinan's?
Yes, I would. So, as I recall, the question from counsel dealt with the issue of my use of the ANES data, which gives us some information about the fraction of white voters who possess passports and the fraction of black voters who possess passports. And I seem to recall that the question was from counsel dealt with similar sorts of fractions that were used by Dr. Callanan in his report that didn't take account of the sort of the incremental nature of the additional form of ID. So for instance, whether someone has a DMV issued ID, right, whether they have a passport or not, doesn't matter because they've already matched on the DMV issued ID. And so a key difference between what I'm doing in my sensitivity analysis and what Dr. Callanan was doing in his report is that in my report, I start with the matching analysis to try to learn as much as I possibly can with a high degree of certainty about whether voters in the voter file match to the available forms of ID. So DMV issued IDs, state agency IDs, school IDs, et cetera. What that gives me is a very good picture for most of the voters in the voter file as to whether they match to one of those forms of ID or not. I know that with a high degree of certainty. What I'm using the additional information, say from the American National Election Study to do, is to use that to inform what might be reasonable assumptions about the portions of the things that we don't know, which are the fraction of new matches that we might expect if we were to include passports. And so my results from the Curry litigation, seeing that a large number of individuals matched on passport after DMV issued ID, suggest that there might be a large number of passport matches. And also the fact that there's evidence that white voters in North Carolina are much more likely to possess unexpired passports than Black voters. Putting those two pieces of information together with the matching analysis gives me some sense of what would have to happen, right? How plausible it would be for passports to get rid of the racial disparity that I've uncovered in the matching analysis. So everything is relative to the matching analysis. The difference is that Dr. Callanan never did the initial matching analysis. He's simply looking at fractions of things that are fractions that are, in some cases, not even individuals in North Carolina. And there's no attempt to sort of start with a baseline number from, say, a matching analysis and think about how those additional pieces of information might impact our views one way or the other on that. So I would view those as two entirely separate enterprises.
Thank you, Professor Quinn. I have no further questions for you subject to any additional recross.
All right, Mr. Patterson, do you have some recross examination questions?
Nothing further for me, Your Honor.
Mr. Cox, what about you?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right,
And
there may be a couple questions from the court. Other judges want to chime in?
Professor Quinn, just a few questions, and I appreciate your time spent here today. Just number one, first of all, can you hear me okay?
I can, Your Honor. Yes.
Okay, this is Judge Ofalu, just for the record. Your testimony about African-American voters being 1.39 times more likely to lack a qualifying ID, you recall that general subject?
I do, yes.
Yes, and I think you said that qualified into a 39% chance that an African-American voter would lack a qualifying ID based on your analysis.
Oh, so I want to be very clear about that. What I stated, or at least the hope that I stated, is that what that translates into is that an African-American voter is 39% more likely than a white voter to lack ID. So not that, you know, it's not that the probability is 0.39, it's that the ratio of those probabilities is equal to 1.39.
Okay, so let me make sure I got it right. So just correct me if I'm wrong, an African-American voter is 39% more likely to lack a qualifying ID?
Yes.
Okay, so here's just my simple mathematical question. When you were talking about voters in 2016 and 2018 being twice as likely, you recall that testimony?
I do, yes, Your Honor.
Okay, just so that we can keep numbers straight, would that translate into a 100% chance that an African-American voter is more likely to lack a qualifying ID
Yes, that's correct, Your Honor.
So it's 39% versus 100% for 2016 and 2018.
That's correct.
Great. The second category was you were being asked about comparative match strings for 589 versus, well, strike that. You were asked extensively about comparative match strings, the 11 categories that you used for 824. Correct?
That's right, Your Honor.
Okay. So were the match strings that were used in your analysis of 824 this time the same as the comparative match strings that were used before in the 589 litigation?
They're very similar. In some cases, as I testified, there are some situations where there were match strings in 589 that look different, but there's a version of that string that's a more inclusive version that's in the current analysis, if that makes sense. So for instance, if one of the match strings, would it be useful to walk through an example from 589?
Well, let me just tell you where I'm trying to go, and then maybe you could just sort of give me the 10,000-foot view. Is the comparison between the numbers of 824 versus 589 sort of the best comparison that you could make given the parameters of those two different studies? In other words, are we comparing apples to apples?
In terms of the sort of the match rates or the number of individuals on the no match list, those kinds of things.
Yes, excluding all the conversation about passports that we've been through exhaustively. I'm just talking about the driver's license, et cetera, other categories.
Yeah, the matching analyses themselves, I don't know that they're exactly similar. I believe we dealt with the mover files slightly differently this time than I did back with the 589 report. But as you saw in that table, the mover files, it's important to include them, but they don't add that many new matches. So the matching analyses themselves are very, very similar. Really, the biggest difference between the two is the access to other forms of ID.
Okay.
And so I'm not going to use the passport word, but yes, other forms of ID.
Okay. All right. And the third category I wanted to ask you about was that you had said in your report, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't have your report in front of me, but I'm just paraphrasing what my understanding is for what you testified to, is that when you were looking at the DMV databases, that you removed IDs from that database that had expired prior to September 20th of 2019, except for those individuals who were 65 years of age or older and whose DMV issued ID was unexpired on the date of their 65th birthday, right? And to my understanding, that's an effort for you to, again, mix apples and apples with the kinds of DMV licenses that would be qualifying under 824.
Yes, Your Honor, that's exactly right.
Okay. Now, so here's my question. The DMV database, well, the DMV keeps not only records of obviously current driver's licenses, but it also keeps records of special identification cards for non-operators, people who are in state of revocation, suspension, things of that nature, or just other folks that want a special ID card and don't have a driver's license. Now, is that category contained within the DMV database that you use to compare in your match analysis with voter registration rolls?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, all forms of ID that would be qualifying for SB 824 purposes that are issued by the DMV are included in the analysis.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Quinn. I appreciate your time with us today.
You're welcome.
Judge Booby.
Are there any other questions from any of the lawyers based upon Judge Ofalu's questions? Mr. Brockman, do you have any other questions of Professor Quinn?
I do not. I just wanted to note for the record that we have advised defendants that we're reserving the right to recall Professor Quinn as a rebuttal witness in response to Professors Callanan and Hood should they testify in the defendant's case.
Okay. Mr. Patterson or Mr. Cox, do either of you have any questions for Professor Quinn based upon the court's questions?
No, Your Honor.
All right, I hadn't heard from Mr. Cox, but I assume if he had any, he'd let us know.
Your Honor, I tried to say it. Maybe it didn't come through.
Yeah, that's fine. Professor Quinn, thank you for being here, sir. You're free to leave. Thank you for your testimony. Apparently, they're keeping you under subpoena for perhaps a recall, so I guess your phone. It's now 4:36 according to the clock on my computer. I don't know, Ms. Riggs, if you're prepared to go ahead and call the next witness, if you want to start on that today, or
Yeah. Thank you, Your Honor. Yes, the plaintiffs are prepared to call our next witness and get through as much as possible. And I'll hand off to my colleague Taylor Williams to call our next witness.
Taylor Williams.
Good afternoon, Your Honors. This is Taylor Williams for the plaintiffs. Can you hear me clearly?
I can, yes. Thank you. Who will be handling this witness for the legislative defendants?
Your Honor, assuming that the witness is Daniel Smith, is that right, Mr. Williams? Yes? Then it will be Nicholas Verone.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. This is Nicholas Verone with Cooper and Kirk for the legislative defendants.
Good afternoon, Mr. Verone. And for the state defendants?
I will, Your Honor. Paul Cox.
Okay, Mr. Cox. We can go ahead and let the witness's name was Daniel. Sorry, I missed that. What's the witness's name?
Daniel Smith, Your Honor.
Daniel Smith. Okay. Can Daniel Smith hear me? Okay. Mr. Smith, I can't hear you. I think you're trying to talk, but maybe he's on mute.
Okay.
All right, I hear you now.
Okay, good.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you clear, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. If you would, please raise your right hand. Ms. Beal, are you prepared to swear in this witness?
I am.
All right, you may proceed.
Do you solemnly affirm that your testimony to the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and this is your solemn affirmation?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. You can lower your hand.
Mr. Williams, you may begin your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Smith. We've met previously, but for the record, my name is Taylor Williams for the plaintiffs. Could you please state your name for the record?
My name is Daniel Smith.
And where do you live, Mr. Smith?
I live in Concord, North Carolina, in Cabarrus County.
About how long have you lived in Concord?
I've lived in Concord going on 8 years. This August will make 8 years that I lived in Concord.
And have you always lived in North Carolina?
No, I haven't.
When did you move to North Carolina?
I moved to North Carolina in 2013.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Smith?
For a living, I am a driver and I'm also a pastor.
Are you affiliated with a specific church?
Yes, the church that I pastor is called Grace City Church, and that's here in Concord, North Carolina.
And how long have you been a pastor, Mr. Smith?
We just started our church in January, so for about 4 months as a lead pastor or senior pastor, but I've been involved in ministry for over 25 years.
You testified that you moved to North Carolina in 2013. Did you register to vote after moving?
I did register to vote after moving, yes.
Have you voted in any elections since moving to North Carolina?
Yes, I have.
Have you ever encountered any difficulty voting in North Carolina?
Yes, I have encountered a difficulty while voting in North Carolina.
Can you briefly explain what happened?
In 2000, and I believe it was 16, during the primary election, I ran into some challenges with the temporary driver's license that I had. And so it was that primary election of 2016 that I ran into some difficulty.
Okay, and I'd like to ask you more about your experience in that election a bit later on, but for now I want to ask some questions about the temporary driver's license. Can you explain why you had a temporary driver's license at that time?
I had a temporary driver's license because I had misplaced my original one that I had.
And at that time, did you possess any other forms of photo identification?
I may have my work ID. I had a picture work ID that I may have had.
And for clarity, who issued you that picture work ID?
As an independent contractor, I was contracted out to a company called Dash Courier Services in Charlotte, and they provided a picture ID with an identification number on it.
Now, turning back to your driver's license, once you learned it was misplaced, did you attempt to get a replacement?
I did. I looked for it for a couple of days, and when it did not come up at some of the places that I thought it may have been, I sought out a replacement.
And why did you decide to seek out a replacement?
Mainly, I'm a driver, and I just always, typically would like to have a driver's license on me in the event that I needed it for anything in terms of, to help ID me or anything.
How did you go about getting a replacement license?
Went to the Division of Motor Vehicle in Concord, North Carolina, and explained to them that I had misplaced or lost my ID, and they took me through the process there of getting a replacement.
And can you explain for the court that process to get a replacement ID?
Sure. As much as I recall, I had to, and I can't remember exactly, but I recall having to show some type of proof of residency, that I did live at the address. And from there, I paid a fee. And from there, I had to sign something basically, which was the temporary ID that they were going to issue me at that point in time. And so that was the process.
What type of information was included in that temporary ID?
The temporary ID had everything that the driver's license that I was replacing had. So it was identical information. The only difference is that it was paper and it was in black and white. But my picture and everything else was identical to what the actual license was.
What was your understanding of how that temporary license could be used?
My understanding was that I would be able to use that temporary license in the same way that I would have been able to use any actual ID. So I thought it pretty much was, the temporary replacement of the ID, and I would have been able to use it in any way that I would have needed to.
How did you come to that understanding?
Just based on my conversation with the gentleman at the DMV.
Okay, now I'd like to turn to some questions about your experience trying to vote in March 2016. Do you recall whether you received any information about voter ID requirements prior to that primary election?
I don't recall receiving anything, no.
Did you receive any informational pamphlets in the mail prior to the March 2016 primary election?
No, I don't recall.
And where did you go to vote for that election?
I went to the elementary school in my community, which was Odell Elementary School in Concord.
What signage, if any, did you see at the polling place?
Nothing that stood out, nothing that I can recall or anything that stood out. I mean, it was some years back, but nothing that stuck out to me in any way.
Do you recall seeing any signage about a voter ID requirement?
I don't recall.
Do you recall seeing any signage about a reasonable impediment declaration?
No, I don't recall that.
And finally, do you recall seeing any signage about state-issued free IDs?
No.
Okay, so can you walk us through what happened once you arrived at the polling place?
Sure. Once I arrived at the polling place, the lines were outside of the door, waited maybe about 10 minutes to get in. And once my wife and I, we got into the polling area, I was asked for my identification. And that's when I presented the temporary ID that I had at that point in time.
And what was the poll worker's response once you presented your temporary ID?
The poll worker's response was pretty much, she kind of paused, she looked at it, and she said she needed to talk to someone else because she wasn't sure if I was going to be able to use that temporary ID.
Okay, and what happened next? How did they determine whether
Um,
your ID was acceptable for voting?
Well, from there, she went to another poll worker, that poll worker, they were having some conversation, but then that poll worker asked me to step out of line. I went to another area, in the polling area, and there was still at that point in time, they didn't want me to hold up the line, but there was some conversation about whether or not I was going to be able to use that temporary license. And at some point, she came back and she told me that I needed to fill out this form.
And during that period while you were pulled out of line, what was going through your head?
I was frustrated. I was a little embarrassed. I didn't know exactly what was happening or why it was happening, just simply because in all my years of voting, I never encountered anything like that. So I was just a little embarrassed, I was a little frustrated. And I just didn't understand at that point in time why I couldn't, proceed to cast a ballot just as my wife and everyone else was.
Did the poll workers then give you any clear instructions on whether that temporary license could be used for voting?
They didn't give me clear instruction, but what they said was, what she told me is that because there was some communication around whether or not that the law was passed or something about if that could be used, and they were uncertain, they were not sure. And because they weren't sure whether or not that would be a valid form of ID, she told me to fill out what I've come to know as a provisional ballot.
How would you describe the demeanor of the poll workers while they tried to make a determination?
I mean, I think it was, I would say it was a little confusing. It was kind of confusion, if you will, because it just the time that I waited, it just gave a sense of uncertainty. And based on what I could hear them talking about whether or not something was passed, could they use it? They weren't sure. I would just say it was a little bit of confusion and a lot of uncertainty about whether or not I could use it.
I would like to ask you some questions about the provisional ballot you were offered, but first, let me ask, were you offered a reasonable impediment provisional ballot at that time?
No.
And at that time, had you heard the term reasonable impediment before?
Never.
At any point while you were at the polling place, were you made to be aware that a reasonable impediment provisional ballot was an option for you?
No.
Okay, so was it your testimony that the poll workers offered you a provisional ballot?
Yes, they offered me a provisional ballot. Mm-hmm.
Had you ever cast a provisional ballot before that point?
No, never.
At that time, were you aware of the process to cure your provisional ballot?
No, I was
Were
not.
Oh, apologize. Were you aware that there was a deadline to cure your provisional ballot?
No, not at all.
Was any of this information provided by the poll workers?
No.
And what was your reaction to being offered the provisional ballot instead of a regular ballot?
I was a little upset, only because I didn't understand exactly what was going on. So I was a little upset that my ballot wasn't being cast. So I was a little upset by that because I had never experienced anything like that before.
And sitting here today, is it now your understanding that your replacement driver's license was required to cure your ballot?
Yes, now it is. Yes.
Mr. Smith, was your vote ultimately counted?
It was not counted.
How did you feel when you found out your vote did not count in that election?
I was a little frustrated, kind of upset about that process. I was rather new to North Carolina. So I was just upset about the fact that it did not count.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Your Honors, at this time, I have no further questions for Mr. Smith.
Mr. Varone, you may cross-examine the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Smith.
Good afternoon.
My name is Nicholas Varone with Cooper and Kirk for the Legislative Defendants. I'm going to be asking you a few questions today. So, Mr. Smith, you currently have an unexpired North Carolina driver's license, correct?
Currently, I do have an unexpired North Carolina driver's license, yes.
And you are aware that a driver's license is an acceptable form of photo ID under the law that you are challenging in this case, correct?
Repeat that question again.
You are aware that a driver's license is an acceptable form of photo ID under the law that you're challenging in this case, correct?
Now I do, yes.
And if in the future you were to lose or forget your driver's license, you are now aware that under the law that you're challenging in this case, SB 824, you can fill out a reasonable impediment form when voting, correct?
Yes, I'm aware of that, yeah, primarily because of my experience of that I had back in 2016, yes.
And similarly, if in the future you were to lose or forget your driver's license, you are now aware that under SB 824, you can cure your provisional ballot by returning to the County Board of Elections with your photo ID, right?
Based on my experience and based on what I've talked, and I haven't read the bill in detail, but based on that and my experiences now, I do know that I would have to do that.
And during the March 2016 primary, I believe you testified during your direct testimony that you went to your local polling place, correct?
That is correct.
And before that March 2016 primary, you had obtained a North Carolina driver's license, but around the time of the primary, that license was misplaced or lost by you, correct?
That is correct.
Because your driver's license had been lost or stolen or misplaced, you had an impediment to presenting your ID when voting in the March 2016 primary, correct?
So when you said there was an impediment, like I couldn't present the actual ID, like
Yes.
the actual permanent ID? I just want to make sure I understand what you're asking.
I can re-ask the question.
Sure.
So before the, sorry, I'll restate. Because your driver's license had been lost or stolen, you had an impediment to presenting your ID when voting in the March 2016 primary, correct?
Right. If the actual permanent ID was necessary, yes.
Are you aware that the current photo ID law is different from the law that was in effect in March 2016? Because under the current photo ID law, you could now cure your provisional ballot by getting a free voter ID from your county board of elections?
I'm not familiar with that law, no.
Are you aware that you're able to get a free voter ID from your county board of elections?
I was not aware. I heard it mentioned, but that was not anything that, as a matter of fact, no, that's not something I was actually aware of, no.
At this point in time, are you now aware that you are able to get a free voter ID from your county board of elections under SB 824?
If that's true, based on the things that have been said pretty much on this call, yes.
And using that photo ID, you could go to your county board of elections to cure your ballot, provisional ballot, correct?
If that's what it says, and based on what you're telling me.
I'd like to talk a little bit about what you remember happened in March 2016. So when you arrived at your polling station during that March 2016 primary election, you gave your name and you handed your temporary ID printed on paper to the poll worker at a table, correct?
She asked me for my ID first, and then I gave her that ID, and then that's when things started.
And the poll, after looking at your temporary paper ID, it was determined that it could not be accepted as an acceptable photo ID under the law in effect at that time, correct?
Based on my experience and based on what happened, it seems as that's the conclusion that they came to, but that's not anything that they ever said directly to me.
And because your photo temporary paper ID was not accepted, you were offered a provisional ballot, correct?
That's what I've come to know it at this time, yes.
It is your testimony that no one at the polling place told you about the process for curing the provisional ballot by returning to your county board of elections with an acceptable ID before the canvass, correct?
That is true.
And when you were at the polling place that day in March 2016, you did not tell the poll workers who offered you the provisional ballot application that the reason you had a temporary paper ID was because you had lost or misplaced your driver's license, correct?
They never asked, so it may have never been mentioned.
Do you recall if you did mention that to the poll workers that day?
I don't recall. I don't remember. I don't recall it coming up as a question, but in a few years back, I don't actually recall the exact wording.
Mr. Smith, do you remember being deposed in this case?
I do.
And when you were deposed, you took an oath to be truthful in your testimony, correct?
That is true.
Mr. Smith, do you remember being asked during that testimony, quote, and did you tell the second poll worker that you had lost your original driver's license card? Do you remember being asked that question?
I don't recall.
Ms. Hardiman, if we could bring up Mr. Smith's deposition. So Mr. Smith, in the court, I'm showing Mr. Smith's deposition, which is LX 130. And we're on page 33, looking at starting at line 10. Mr. Smith, I'm just gonna read this to you. And so the question that was asked, and did you tell the second poll worker that you had lost your original driver's license card? No, I didn't mention that I lost it, but obviously that was the one I had. So I mentioned to her, this is the only ID that I have. And I was told that I would be able to use it for anything that I would use my driver's license for. So do you recall giving that testimony?
I do. If that's what I say, yes.
And so focusing on the provisional ballot that you, thanks, Ms. Hardiman, you can take that down. And I'll start again, Mr. Smith. Thinking about that provisional ballot application that you filled out that day, you don't actually remember what it looked like. Isn't that right?
Not exactly what it looked like. I can't, not exactly, no.
And you don't remember exactly what the provisional ballot said, correct?
Word for word, no, I don't.
And you don't remember if you read the provisional ballot in full, correct?
Again, I may have, and I don't recall exactly what it said, but what I do recall was pretty much the frustration that surrounded kind of the uncertainty around whether or not, I could vote or what was gonna happen. So, and as I mentioned earlier, it was a little bit of frustration. It was confusion on their part. So, I don't remember exactly, or I don't recall, if I've read the whole thing or exactly what, because my conversation was more with them in terms of what was happening and what I had to do.
Okay. Mr. Smith, I'm going to show you an exhibit that's been marked as JX734, which is a training presentation prepared by the State Board of Elections on North Carolina voting procedures in 2016. This exhibit has already been admitted into evidence by the court on Monday afternoon. If we scroll down to page 107.
Objections, Your Honor.
Sustained. Asking you a different question.
Okay. Mr. Smith, do you recall on the provisional ballot application that you filled out that there were certain affirmations that you were requested to make in order to fill out that provisional ballot?
Honestly, I don't recall. I don't recall exactly affirmations or what was said. Again, I mentioned it was kind of a little bit of confusion, frustration on my part, and I don't know exactly what those affirmations were. I don't recall what they said at that point in time.
And during your deposition, Mr. Smith, that we were referring to previously, do you remember being shown a provisional ballot application?
I don't recall.
Mr. Verone, it's now 5 o'clock. If you've got 5 or 10 minutes more, then we can, maybe, I would like for this gentleman to be able to get back to work tomorrow. But if you're, just getting started with him, then tell me.
Your Honor, I should only have a little bit left here. I should be able to finish up in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Smith, it is your testimony that the poll workers at the polling place you went to in March 2016 did not inform you of the reasonable impediment option, correct?
Yes, that's what I said. Yes, correct.
And you believe that the poll workers that you encountered in March 2016 made a mistake, correct?
Based on what I know now, they didn't do all that was kind of laid out and what the process is. They didn't do that.
You now believe that you should have been given a reasonable impediment form in March 2016, correct?
Yes, based on my understanding now, I should have been.
If you had voted by filling out a reasonable impediment form, you have no reason to believe that your vote would not be counted, correct?
If that's the process, I guess I'm not sure because it didn't count last time. So I can't say for certain if it would count, but if that's the process, that's the process.
You would agree that the problem that you encountered in March 2016 was at least partly because of how the poll workers implemented the photo ID law, correct?
Make sure I understand that right. You said as the poll workers implemented the law. Could you repeat the question?
Yes, I can repeat the question. You would agree that the problem that you encountered in March 2016 was at least partly because of how the poll workers implemented the voter ID law, correct?
I mean, I don't know what their implementation process was. I just know that I encountered the problem, based on my experiences because they weren't sure what they should do. And I think that was partly what played into, my vote ultimately not counting, is because they were unsure what to do.
You would agree with me that if poll workers from 2016 had better training going forward, that could decrease the chance of implementation problems, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Mr. Smith, Roy Cooper is the governor of North Carolina, correct?
Correct.
As governor, he's in charge of enforcing the laws in the state of North Carolina, right?
Based on my understanding, he's the governor, yes.
You have no reason to believe that Governor Cooper would implement the law in a way that disenfranchises voters, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Those are all my questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Cox, do you have any cross-exam?
No, Your Honors.
All right, Mr. Williams, do you have any redirect?
No, Your Honors.
All right, thank you, Mr. Smith. You're free to go.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Ms. Rigg, you have anything else for today?
No, Your Honor, but we deeply appreciate you being willing to go a few minutes longer to accommodate our witness.
Sure. I want to remind everyone that tomorrow's schedule is different than what it's been the rest of the week. Tomorrow we start at 9 a.m. instead of 9:30. Okay, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. is our schedule tomorrow. We'll take 2 morning breaks. Please make sure you've got your witnesses ready to start at 9 instead of 9:30. I don't want to take too long right now, Ms. Riggs, but maybe a little status check is in order. sort of where we're at, where we're going? Are we 1/4 of the way through the plaintiff's evidence? Are we closer to a half, 3/4? Are we 4/5? I don't want to pin you down on that too much.
I'm trying to get updated hours. I would say of the predicted 30 hours, we are a much smaller percentage of the way through our case than the defendants are. As far as number of witnesses go, we anticipated to have at least another witness and a half today done. We are going to have issues with legislators' timing given the session. But we, so 7 hours so far plaintiffs, this is a rough, I'm sorry, 7 hours, 10 minutes for plaintiffs' time, 11 hours, 12 minutes for defendants' time. My best guess is that plaintiffs might be wrapping their case in chief Wednesday, maybe Thursday morning at the rate that we're going.
Okay, that's fine. And this question goes really to all three lead counsel, Ms. Riggs, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Cox. Are there any issues that you need to bring up as far as health, wellness of everyone involved? Are you still hanging in there? How's your mental health going? Or do you have what I've heard it called Zoom fatigue? This is not Zoom, but it's close. Are you doing okay? Is there anything that we can do to make it better for you? How's things going generally?
Your Honor, this is Allison Riggs. Thank you for your very kind inquiry. We're grateful for your attention and for all of the staff's assistance with technical difficulties. We're just trying to schedule with our clients and witnesses and trying to be as minimally disruptive for them as possible.
Sure. Mr. Thompson, do you have anything to add to that or take away?
Just to echo those thanks for the kind inquiry. I think everyone's doing well on our team, so we really appreciate the court's inquiry. Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Cox, what about you?
Thank you, Your Honor. I and the rest of my colleagues are doing all right, and we appreciate the concerns.
I haven't seen the rest of your colleagues. I get different lawyers for plaintiff each time, different for legislative defendants, but you're just carrying the water for the state defendants. So I'm ready to see some of your colleagues. No offense to you, but, you mentioned your other colleagues, but they're not on stage with you very much.
I will let them know that. But we've arranged this so that I'm going to be the sort of main person you're going to see. There are other folks working with me, but I will let them know that you're interested in seeing their faces.
I say that just as to add a little levity to it. But you're doing a great job, all of you, and it's actually refreshing to see different lawyers come in that I haven't seen before. So kudos to all of them. All of you are doing a fantastic job for your respective clients. All right, so we'll start back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Hope that you all have a good evening, and we will see you then. And we can go ahead and end this session for